The Huguenots were a religious group of French Protestants who held to the Reformed or Calvinist tradition of Protestantism. The term, which may be derived from the name of a Swiss political leader, the Genevan burgomaster Besançon Hugues, was in common use by the mid-16th century. Huguenot was frequently used in reference to those of the Reformed Church of France from the time of the Protestant Reformation. By contrast, the Protestant populations of eastern France in Alsace, Moselle, and the Montbéliard were mainly Lutherans. On the eve of the St. Bartholomew Days massacre in 1572, the Huguenot community made up as much as 10% of the French population. By 1600, it had declined to 7 to 8% and was reduced further late in the century after the return of persecution under Louis XIV, who instituted the Dragonnades to forcibly convert Protestants and then finally revoked all Protestant rights in his Edict of Fontainebleau of 1685. The Huguenots were concentrated in the southern and western parts of France. As Huguenots gained influence and more openly displayed their faith, Roman Catholic hostility grew. A series of religious conflicts followed, known as the French Wars of Religion, fought intermittently from 1562 to 1598. The Huguenots were led by Jeanne d'Albret, her son the future Henry IV, and the princes of Condé. The wars ended with the Edict of Nantes of 1598, which granted the Huguenots substantial religious, political, and military autonomy. Huguenot rebellions in the 1620s resulted in the abolition of their political and military privileges. They retained the religious provisions of the Edict of Nantes until the rule of Louis XIV, who gradually increased persecution of Protestantism until he issued the Edict of Fontainebleau. This ended legal recognition of Protestantism in France, and the Huguenots were forced to either convert to Roman Catholicism or flee as refugees, and they were subjected to violent dragonnades. Louis XIV claimed that the French Huguenot population was reduced from around 900,000 or 800,000 to just 1,000 or 1,500. Of course, this decline was exaggerated, but the dragonnades was devastating for the French Protestant community. The exodus of Huguenots from France created a brain drain, as many of them had occupied important places in society. The remaining Huguenots faced continual persecution under Louis XV. By the time of his death in 1774, Calvinism had been nearly eliminated from France. Persecution of Protestants officially ended with the Edict of Versailles signed by Louis XVI in 1787. 2 years later, with the Revolutionary Declaration of the Rights of Man and of the Citizen of 1789, Protestants gained equal rights as citizens. The availability of the Bible in vernacular languages was important to the spread of the Protestant movement and development of the Calvinist Church in France. The country had a long history of struggles with the papacy by the time the Protestant Reformation finally arrived. Around 1294, a French version of the Scriptures was prepared by the Roman Catholic priest Guyard de Moulins. The first known translation of the Bible into one of France's many languages, Arpitin, had been prepared by 12th century pre-Protestant reformer Peter Waldo. The Waldensians created fortified areas as in Cabrières, perhaps attacking an abbey. They were suppressed by Francis I in 1545 in the massacre of Mirandol. Other predecessors of the Calvinist Church included the pro-reform and Gallican Roman Catholics, such as Jacques Lefebvre. The Gallicans briefly achieved independence for the French Church on the principle that the religion of France could not be controlled by the Bishop of Rome, a foreign power. During the Protestant Reformation, Lefebvre, a professor at the University of Paris, published his French translation of the New Testament in 1523, followed by the whole Bible in the French language in 1530. William Farel was a student of Lefebvre, who went on to become a leader of the Swiss Reformation, establishing a Protestant Republican government in Geneva. John Calvin, another student at the University of Paris, also converted to Protestantism. Long after the sect was suppressed by Francis I, the remaining French Waldensians, then mostly in the Luberon region, sought to join Farel, Calvin, and the Reformation, and Olivetan published a French Bible for them. The French Confession of 1559 shows a decidedly Calvinistic influence. Now, like other religious reformers of the time, Huguenots felt that the Roman Catholic Church needed a radical cleansing of its impurities, and that the Pope represented a worldly kingdom which sat in mocking tyranny over the things of God, and was ultimately doomed. Rhetoric like this became fiercer as events unfolded, and eventually stirred up a reaction in the Roman Catholic establishment. Fanatically opposed to the Roman Catholic Church, the Huguenots killed priests, monks, and nuns, attacked monasticism, and destroyed sacred images, relics, and church buildings. Most of the cities in which the Huguenots gained a hold saw iconoclastic riots in which altars and images in churches, and sometimes the buildings themselves, were torn down. Ancient relics and texts were destroyed, the bodies of saints were exhumed and burned. The cities of Bourges, Montauban, and Orléans saw substantial activity in this regard. The Huguenots transformed themselves into a definitive political movement thereafter. Protestant preachers rallied a considerable army and a formidable cavalry, which came under the leadership of Admiral Gaspard de Coligny. Henry of Navarre and the House of Bourbon allied themselves to the Huguenots, adding wealth and territorial holdings to the Protestant strength, which at its height grew to 60 fortified cities and posed a serious and continuous threat to the Roman Catholic crown and Paris over the next 3 decades. The Roman Catholic Church in France and many of its members opposed the Huguenots. Some Huguenot preachers and congregants were attacked as they attempted to meet for worship. The height of this persecution was the St. Bartholomew's Day massacre in August 1572, when 5,000 to 30,000 were killed, although there were also underlying political reasons for this as well, as some of the Huguenots were nobles trying to establish separate centers of power in southern France. Retaliating against the French Roman Catholics, the Huguenots formed their own militia. Now, early in his reign, Francis I had persecuted the Waldensians in southeastern France. Francis initially protected the Huguenot dissidents from parliamentary measures seeking to exterminate them. After the 1534 affair of the placards, however, he distanced himself from the Huguenots and their protection. Huguenot numbers grew rapidly between 1555 and 1561, chiefly amongst nobles and city dwellers. During this time, their opponents first dubbed the Protestant Huguenots, but they called themselves Reformed, and organized the First National Synod in 1558 in Paris. By 1562, the estimated number of Huguenots peaked at approximately 2 million, concentrating mainly in the west, south, and some of central France, compared to around 16 million Roman Catholics during the same time. Persecution diminished the number of Huguenots, however, who remained in France. As the Huguenots gained influence and displayed their faith more openly, Roman Catholic hostility towards them grew, even though the French crown offered increasingly liberal political concessions and edicts of toleration. Following the accidental death of Henry II in 1559, his son succeeded as King Francis II along with his wife, the Queen Consort, also known as Mary, Queen of Scots. During the 18 months of the reign of Francis II, Mary encouraged a policy of rounding up French Huguenots on charges of heresy and putting them in front of Roman Catholic judges, and employing torture and burning as punishment for dissenters. Mary returned to Scotland a widow in the summer of 1561. In 1561, the Edict of Orléans declared an end to the persecution, and the Edict of Saint-Germain of January 1562 formally recognized the Huguenots for the first time. However, these measures disguised the growing tensions between Protestants and Roman Catholics. These tensions spurred 8 civil wars, interrupted by periods of relative calm, between 1562 and 1598. With each break in peace, the Huguenots' trust in the Roman Catholic throne diminished, and the violence became more severe, and Protestant demands became grander until a lasting peace finally occurred in 1598. The wars gradually took on a dynastic character, developing into an extended feud between the houses of Bourbon and Guise, both of which, in addition to holding rival religious views, staked a claim to the French throne. The crown, occupied by the House of Valois, generally supported the Roman Catholic side, but on occasion would switch over to the Protestant cause when it was politically convenient. The French Wars of Religion began with the massacre of Vassy on the 1st of March 1562, when dozens of Huguenots were killed, and about 200 were wounded. It was in this year that some Huguenots destroyed the tomb and remains of St. Irenaeus, an early church father and bishop. The Michelade by Huguenots against Roman Catholics happened later on the 29th of September 1567. Now, as mentioned earlier, during the St. Bartholomew's Day massacre of August 24th, Roman Catholics killed thousands of Huguenots in Paris, and similar massacres took place in other towns in the following weeks. Although the exact number of deaths throughout the country is not known, on the 23rd and 24th of August, between 2,000 and 3,000 Protestants were killed in Paris, and a further 3,000 to 7,000 more in the French provinces. By the 17th of September, almost 25,000 Protestants had been massacred in Paris alone. And beyond Paris, the killings continued until the 3rd of October. And, to make it all worse, an amnesty granted in 1573 pardoned the perpetrators. The pattern of warfare, which was followed by brief periods of peace, continued for nearly another quarter century. The warfare was definitively quelled in 1598, when Henry of Navarre, having succeeded to the French throne as Henry IV, and having recanted Protestantism in favor of Roman Catholicism in order to obtain the French crown, issued the Edict of Nantes. The edict reaffirmed Roman Catholicism as the state religion of France, but granted the Protestants equality with Roman Catholics under the throne, and a degree of religious and political freedom within their domains. The edict simultaneously protected Roman Catholic interests by discouraging the founding of new Protestant churches in Roman Catholic-controlled regions. With the proclamation of the Edict of Nantes and the subsequent protection of Huguenot rights, pressures to leave France increased. However, enforcement of the edict grew increasingly irregular over time, making life so intolerable that many fled the country. The Huguenot population of France dropped to 856,000 by the mid-1660s, and a plurality lived in rural areas. Montpellier was among the most important of the 66 protected cities that the Edict of 1598 had granted to the Huguenots. The city's political institutions and the university were all handed over to the Huguenots. Tensions within Paris led to a siege by the royal army in 1622. Peace terms called for the dismantling of the city's fortifications. A royal citadel was built, and the university and consulate were taken over by the Roman Catholic party. Even before the Edict of Alès in 1629, Protestant rule was dead, and the Ville de Sûreté was no more. By 1620, the Huguenots were on the defensive, and the government increasingly applied pressure. A series of 3 small civil wars known as the Huguenot rebellions broke out, mainly in southwestern France between 1621 and 1629, in which the Calvinist areas revolted against royal authority. The uprising occurred a decade following the death of Henry IV, who was assassinated by a Roman Catholic fanatic in 1610. His successor, Louis XIII, under the regency of his Italian Roman Catholic mother, Marie de' Medici, was more intolerant of Protestantism. The Huguenots responded by establishing independent political and military structures, establishing diplomatic contacts with foreign powers, and openly revolting against central power. Now, Louis XIV inherited the throne in 1643 and acted increasingly aggressively to force the Huguenots to convert. At first, he sent missionaries backed by a fund to financially reward converts to Roman Catholicism. Then he imposed increasing penalties, closed Huguenot schools, and excluded them from favored profession. Escalating, he instituted dragonnades, which included the occupation and looting of Huguenot homes by military troops in an effort to forcibly convert them. In 1685, he issued the Edict of Fontainebleau, revoking the Edict of Nantes and declaring Protestantism illegal. The revocation forbade Protestant services, required education of children as Roman Catholics, and prohibited emigration. It proved disastrous to the Huguenots and costly for France. It precipitated civil bloodshed, ruined commerce, and resulted in the illegal flight from the country of hundreds of thousands of Protestants, many of whom were intellectuals, doctors, and business leaders, whose skills were transferred to Britain, as well as Holland, Prussia, and South Africa, and other places they fled to. 4,000 of them emigrated to the 13 colonies, where they settled, especially New York, the Delaware Valley, in eastern Pennsylvania, New Jersey, and Virginia. The English authorities welcomed the French refugees, providing money from both government and private agencies to aid their relocation. Those Huguenots who stayed in France were subsequently forcibly converted to Roman Catholicism and were called new converts. After this, the Huguenots fled to Protestant countries such as England, the Netherlands, Switzerland, Norway, Denmark, and Prussia, whose Calvinist great elector, Frederick William, welcomed them to help rebuild his war-ravaged and underpopulated country. Following this exodus, Huguenots remained in large numbers in only one region of France, the rugged Cévennes region in the south. There were also some Calvinists in the Alsace region, which then belonged to the Holy Roman Empire. In the early 18th century, a regional group known as a Camisards rioted against the Roman Catholic Church, burning churches and killing the clergy. It took French troops years to hunt down and destroy all the bands of Camisards between 1702 and 1709. By the 1760s, Protestantism was no longer a favorite religion of the elite, and by then most Protestants were just Cévennes peasants. It was still illegal, though, to be Protestant, and although the law was not often enforced, it could be a threat or a nuisance to Protestants. Calvinists mainly lived in the Midi. About 200,000 Lutherans, accompanied by some Calvinists, lived in the newly acquired Alsace, where the 1648 Treaty of Westphalia effectively protected them. Persecution of Protestants diminished in France after 1724, finally ending with the Edict of Versailles, known as the Edict of Tolerance, signed by Louis XVI in 1787. Now, 2 years later, as mentioned, with the declarations of the rights of man and citizen, Protestant gains equal rights as citizens.